So, welcome everybody to this very, very special lecture on the archaeoastronomy of the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic monument at Callanish on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides by the one and only Professor Clive Ruggles. The lecture is co-hosted by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and Urras and Tursachan, the Callanish Stones Trust, and it's sponsored by Historic Environment Scotland. My name's Alison Sheridan, and I have two hats on tonight as a council member of the Society, and I would encourage you all to become a fellow of the Society, and as a board member of Urras and Tursachan. And as many of you will know, this is a momentous week, since not only will there be the summer solstice on Thursday night when the sun goes down and Friday morning when it comes up just a few hours later, marking the longest day of the year, but we are also in the season for the moon's major southern standstill phenomenon, the lunar, which only happens every 18.6 years. And on Friday night, English Heritage will be live streaming the moonrise from 9:30 in the evening, and Urras and Tursachan will be live streaming the moon when it rises at Callanish, we hope, just after 1 a.m., weather permitting, that is. Our speaker tonight, Professor Clive Ruggles, needs very little introduction as he is so well known as one of the world's finest, if not, I would say the finest archaeoastronomers, with experience not just in Britain, but much further afield, including in Peru on the Nazca lines. His many publications include this fundamentally important and much thumbed book, Astronomy in Prehistoric Britain and Ireland, that was published way back in 1999. But most recently, there's a brand new book that he's written with Amanda Chadburn, and it's been published by English Heritage, and it's called Stonehenge Sighting the Sun. And I cannot recommend it too highly. You just got to rush out and buy a copy of this. It's a real treat and a cracking read. And it relates to a project that Clive and Amanda are doing with English Heritage on Stonehenge and all the aspects of its archaeoastronomy. Callanish is sometimes called the Stonehenge of the North, but actually up here in Scotland, we prefer to think of Stonehenge as the Callanish of the South. So we're in for a real treat tonight, and Clive has kindly agreed to answer questions at the end. So do please write your questions in the chat area. And as I say, don't forget to keep your microphones muted. So without more ado, I'd like to welcome Clive in the warmest possible terms to present his lecture, Sighting the Sun and Moon at Callanish. Over to you, Clive.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for that very flattering introduction, Alison. That's just great. And good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me fine. And everyone knows, don't they, that Stonehenge is aligned with June solstice sunrise. And there's the thousands of people from a couple of years ago watching it on one of the few solstice mornings when you could actually see the sun and it wasn't cloudy. And a lot of people know, everyone knows, a lot of people know that Callanish is related to the major standstill moon, and there's a lot of people that are getting interested in Callanish this year. Well, I'm going to try and get to the bottom of some of what we know about this and what's behind all that. And what's behind all that, to start with, a little bit of history and background here, is an awful lot of controversy. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into what all this stuff means. But going back, gosh, it's more than half a century. That's worrying. He was Scottish engineer, Alexander Thom, who was the engineering professor at Oxford, wrote a series of 3 books all about Scottish megaliths, stone circles, stone rows, and other standing stones. And he claimed that they were solar and lunar observatories. And he had an awful lot of statistics to back up his arguments, which is what that graph, for one thing, is showing. He reckoned there was a megalithic calendar with points with the sites around Scotland and also a few down in England as well, marking different points in the solar year. And also a whole lot of lunar observatories. And that's the title of his second book, Megalithic Lunar Observatories. There it is, straight out. And he won over an awful lot of astronomers and statisticians at the time. I say he went to hundreds of sites to produce his stats. But archaeologists were always suspicious, and it was statements like that. I don't know how well you can read it on your various screens, but megalithic man, as he called him, was a competent engineer, had an extensive knowledge of practical geometry, and studied the motions of the sun and moon in great detail. This is what archaeologists call ethnocentrism. It's seeing yourself in the past, and this worried people at the time. And basically, Tom's ideas split the community down the middle, probably for about 20 years. One side, mainly astronomers, many engineers, thinking that many of these Scottish megalithic sites were some sort of ancient observatory with accurate solar and lunar alignments in them. And the other side, mainly archaeologists, not really understanding the stats, but somehow being deeply suspicious and not believing a word of it, and thinking, no, this was nonsense that these sites had anything to do with astronomy. This was like, ley lines and other things that they also regarded as nonsense. And of course, the truth was somewhere in the middle. Well, before I get on to that, why bother at all? Why should we worry about what relationship any of these ancient sites had to do with the sun or the moon or astronomy? And I think for me, to give you the answer, I'm going to take you out to Australia very briefly in your mind's eye. And I'm out there, this is about 15 years ago, with a guy who was, well, the closest thing to a sort of academic version of Crocodile Dundee that you can imagine. What it was like being one of his students, I do not know. But anyway, we're out looking at Aboriginal rock art sites in Australia, middle of nowhere, middle of the night, in a tent. John, that was his name, is rattling on the tent. Clive, come out and look at the emu. John, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I do not want to come out and look at an emu. But anyway, he persuaded me up. And what he meant was the emu in the sky. And what I saw then that night, I think, was the darkest night sky I've ever seen in my life. And just a curtain of stars overhead. And you could see the Milky Way behind it. And it appeared as behind those stars. And then the dark clouds, they're actually clouds out in space, but hydrogen clouds out in space. And there's this dark looming shape of an emu filling half the sky, going up. The beak was above my head, and long and thin emu against the Milky Way. And you're thinking, wow, this thing was looming over you. How can we in the Western world imagine constellations by joining the dots of stars when there's this actual shape of a blooming great emu over you? And basically, it's another way of perceiving the sky. And that's what archaeoastronomy is all about. It's how other peoples in the past and the present, for that matter, have perceived the sky in different ways. And the sky was important to people in the past. Oh, that's the emu again, same emu. It's a beautiful picture of it. It's as good as it gets. Seeing it is even better. But down at the bottom, can you see my pointer, by the way, on my screen? Alice, yeah, brilliant. There's a rock art depiction of it. People in the past lived with dark skies. Every night the sky was clear. They didn't have light pollution. Most of us never see a truly dark sky. And there they are. They're seeing this every night. It's part of their environment. Only part of it. Of course, they're living with all the things in the natural world around them, all the animals, all the people and so on, all the social stuff going on. But all the stuff going on in the sky was a big part of that as well. It's this part that we're trying to understand what they were doing in the past. We can't ignore. And I can't ignore the fact I'm going backwards rather than forwards. That's better. But also, it's a part that's quite important for us as archaeologists, I think, because we can visualize what their skies look like. It's a part of their environment that they perceived that we can see directly using today's tools on computers. And we can see and we can visualize their skies. We can turn the clock back in the computer. We can understand where things were rising and setting, what stars they saw, where the sun and moon was. And that's something we can't say about many other aspects of their environment. We don't know generally, we only know in broad terms what their environment looked like. But if they were relating things to the skies in the past, we can actually detect that and measure that directly. Now, what archaeoastronomers do is all about seeking tangible connections between things in the record, things that we can see like monuments and artifacts, and things in the sky, and we try to interpret them. And the most obvious tangible connection is alignments, things on the ground, like Stonehenge aligning on the solstice. But then there are other ways. Counts of things are another things. Here's a calendar on it's a calendar from a hunter-gatherer people in northern Mexico, and it's counting off months for hunting purposes. Here's the famous Nebra disc. Representations are another thing. Representation of the skies. But each of these things brings its problems with interpreting. Just because something's pointing at something interesting for us in the sky doesn't mean that was deliberate, because there's an awful lot of stuff goes on in the sky. So just because we find what appears to be an alignment doesn't mean it was meaningful to anyone in the past. The same thing with counts of things. Just because people might find a bit of rock art somewhere with 29 dots and there are 29 days in the lunar month doesn't mean that they were counting off the lunar days. It could be something else. And this representation, the Nebra disc, people have tried to argue that it was some sort of device for looking at the stars and a measuring device. It was some sort of literal representation. It wasn't. And there are many levels and many ways, and you can argue that. It was clearly some sort of astral representation. It was giving power to the user in a general way. But trying to interpret that as some sort of astronomical instrument is very, very controversial. So we have to be careful when we're interpreting things. Oh, and there's many names what you might call us. So I would call myself an archaeoastronomer. There are people who look at indigenous astronomers, call themselves ethnoastronomers. Cultural astronomy, that was a term that I and my colleague Nick Saunders thought up in 1990, as it was less of a mouthful than archaeo and ethnoastronomy. And it's been taken on board by a lot of people. But a lot of people don't like the use of the word astronomy, because that kind of implies modern astronomy, and we're trying to get at how people in the past perceive things. Some people prefer sky watching. That's a bit passive. I don't like that term, but some people use it. And there's also skyscape archaeology, which is a quite prevalent term now. And that's been brought about because people thought, well, there is landscape archaeology. There are archaeologists who understand how people understood the landscape around them, perceived it, and live with it. Well, the skyscape was actually part of that environment. And it's our problem that we separate landscape from skyscape. They almost certainly didn't. But I'm not sure I like the term, because I don't think we kind of want to separate skyscape archaeology from landscape archaeology. It should all be one and the same thing. Maybe we need a better term. Whatever terms we use, I couldn't help but throw this one in. If we're archaeoastronomy, well, there's archaeogastronomy for you. I do like that. And remember about pizzas. I'm going to bring pizzas in again later in the talk. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention in the background, there's a lot of background. I will get round to Scotland, maybe even Callanish before I finish, but of course I will. But here's a tomb. It's actually Knockrow in Ireland, and it's got two passages. And one is aligned on where the sun rises on the shortest day, December solstice, and the other is aligned on where it sets on that same day. It's got these two beautiful solstitial alignments. But orientation of things, like monuments, like houses, like other things, could be influenced by many, many different things. And this was one of the problems, earlier problems with archaeoastronomy. People tended to say, well, is this orientation astronomical or isn't it? Well, it could be many things. And these days, we are much more, we understand that astronomy is just part of it. It's not a part to be ignored. Like with the Irish tombs, there's an Irish archaeoastronomer, Frank Prendergast, who's done, Prendergast, if I can say his name rightly, who has done a lot of work on this. He studied many Irish passage tombs through Neolithic, 130 odd that had measurable orientations. And there are many of them that are not astronomical at all, discernibly. Only about 15 of them, only a bit more than 10% of them have these solstitial alignments. That's quite a few, but most of them are oriented on other things. A whole load of them are oriented on other tombs. Here's a beautiful prominent example from Loch Crew, another site. Newgrange, I'll mention that in the middle, a famous solstitial one. I'll mention that in a moment. But right next to it, in the same area in the Boyne Valley, is Knowth. And Knowth doesn't share that solstitial alignment, has a solar alignment, but it's surrounded by little satellite tombs, and they're all pointing in at the main tomb. So the point being, there's many different influences on orientation. Where we do find the solar one, it can be impressive. Newgrange in Ireland is really the beautiful example of this. So here, the sun shines in to this dark passage, 20-meter long passage, and would have lit up the bones of the dead just for a few minutes around dawn on days around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And here you can see it shone in over through a roof box, which was designed so that when the people had stopped laying the bones of the dead in here and shut off the tomb with large stones, as was the practice, the sun still shone in on the bones of the dead. This wasn't any sort of observatory. What it's telling us is that there was some connection in people's minds between, on the one hand, death, ancestors, ancestor spirits, and on the other hand, the sun, seasons, seasonal renewal. And the fact of that alignment is telling us that. We can speculate on exactly how that was playing out in people's minds. We don't know. You can imagine maybe they thought that ancestor spirits came out and helped turn the sun around so that everything would regenerate in the next season. That's our speculation. But the base of that is the fact of the alignment. And we have monuments that connect to other solar bodies. Here's a beautiful one. I must just take you to Hawaii briefly because I'm lucky enough to do a lot of field work there. And this is a very strange wall we found at the tip of the Hawaiian island of Maui, the southernmost tip of the island. Very remote place. Takes 3 hours to get down there in a Land Rover. And it's an isolated wall. It's not connected to anything. It never was. Just a huge solid wall, about 20 meters long, well built, about a meter and a bit high, and it has this huge notch in the middle that you can see in this photograph taken at night. And it aligns beautifully upon the Southern Cross just when it was upright. So it's slightly off south in order to get the upright Southern Cross. Well, okay, what was the meaning of that? Well, we have ethnohistory. We have a lot of other evidence other than just the alignment evidence to inform us at this site. We know from the ethnohistory that the Southern Cross in Polynesian navigation, it was the symbolism of navigating to the south. These people came up to Hawaii originally from what's now French Polynesia, Tahiti, and they plied the Pacific back and forth for a few centuries. Around about 1400, 1300, 1400, that stopped. We have an accurate date for this wall. We have a dating, we have uranium thorium dating, not radiocarbon dating as per often used. Uranium thorium is a clock that's set off by when you take a head of coral out of the sea, which fortunately for us was a practice that people did and would put a bit of coral in when they were building something and that gives us accurate dates to plus or minus 2 years. And we know that this wall was built around the time that long distance voyaging was finishing. We also have evidence from place names around. The place names reflect place names in Tahiti. And in fact, the whole area of that this wall is in is called Kahiki Nui, which means Big Tahiti in the Hawaiian dialect. Putting this and a whole load of other things together, Pat Kirch, who's an archaeological colleague, and I have argued that it was actually a memorial wall. It was a wall to memorialize voyaging, just built just after that voyaging had stopped, or maybe to memorialize the last great voyager, which we know about from Hawaiian oral literature that was passed down. Putting those things together, this was a wall that connected to the stars, but we know it because we have a whole lot of ethnohistorical evidence as well as archaeological evidence to back that up. Similarly, here's a Mayan site in Mexico, this is related to Venus. Now, planets. The problem with planets is that their motions, they're very complex and they're very similar to the sun's motions in the sky. How can you ever pick out an alignment on Venus? Here's a temple in a Mayan site dating to 900 and I think it's 25 AD. We have the date exactly because the Mayans had a long count calendar and they inscribed the date. And we also know that this building was dedicated to Venus. It has glyphs because the Mayans had hieroglyphs, they had inscriptions. The front of this building had loads and loads of Venus glyphs on it. It's as if it was screaming Venus. If you were a Mayan, it would be screaming Venus in neon lights. And And also, we know generally how important Venus was to the Mayans because we have written evidence, the Dresden Codex being a Mayan book that was preserved. So again, we have a whole lot of evidence that convinces this was an alignment on the most southerly rising position of Venus in that year, or some argue it worked the other way, but none of us has any doubt that that was aligned, is anomalously aligned building, was aligned upon Venus. So, but if we didn't have that corroborating evidence, we would never be able to prove it. We wouldn't believe it. Well, what about the moon? So I've talked about stars and planets and sun, and what about the moon? Well, what aligns upon the moon? What do we know about? Well, the thing about the moon, before we get onto alignments, is that as far as peoples in the past, calendars, particularly telling time, are concerned, the moon is the most important thing in the sky. Very generally, the cycle of the moon, the phase cycle, 29.5 days on average, is the most obvious cycle in the sky. It's obvious to anyone who just sees the moon from night to night, full moon nights when you can see around, all that sort of thing. And there are calendars around the world based on the moon. And I just wanted to show you one of them. This is from Africa. This is the Mursi in Africa. It was studied in the 1970s before they had contact with many Westerners. And they have a moon-based calendar. Now, our problem as Westerners coming into this is, well, we know there are 12.5 lunar months, phase cycle months in a year, so they must have got out of step. The Morsi calendar never did. They sing you a song. The children sing you a song telling you what happens in each month. They tell you that in month 8, the big rains fall, and they never talk about missing a month or adding a month. But what you discover when you, or if you were the anthropologist working with them, discover is that actually no one ever really quite knows what month it is at any one time, although everyone believes it. It's a matter of discussion, dispute. Everything they discuss, the Morsi love having these big meetings to discuss. This is a war meeting, but they discuss the calendar too. When the big rains fall, it doesn't suddenly mean everyone knows it's month 8, because everyone knows the big rains come a bit earlier, a bit late some years. When there are people amongst the Morsi who look at the sun going up and down the horizon as it rises over the year, and they talk about it going into its houses when it appears to rise in the same place. But they, of course, don't know that the sun's any more accurate a seasonal indicator than the flowers, the birds, and many other things they look at. And in fact, they're not specialists. They're not people with any special status that happen to look at the sun. They're just people with a hobby. They tend to be the same people that have the same hobby as divining the future and goat entrails. There you are. You didn't think I was going to be showing you pictures of goat entrails in the middle of this, but there you are. But this is just basically to show you a calendar in practice. And, you think, we tend to think, oh, lunar calendar, have to fit it in a solar year. How did they do that? What I'm saying is that calendars in the past, they were very, very contextual. And to understand them fully, they worked in practice with a whole lot of other social factors. And of course, in order to understand that in the past as now, we have to think about what the archaeology is telling us. Now, there's perhaps one moon-related monument that people talk about a lot, particularly it's Chimney Rock in Colorado. And the point about this is it's an Anasazi monument from a few centuries ago, and there are these two huge natural rock pillars as seen from the Anasazi, if I can say it, settlement, and there's this beautiful notch between them, as you see from there, because they're looking at an angle. It's just too far north for the sun to ever rise in, but the moon is seen there at a major standstill when it's seen peculiarly far to the north. People argue about whether this was deliberate or not, but there are actually some cultural reasons for believing that it was known, was deliberate, and it's now become quite an important place in North America for that reason. And in fact, the coming Friday night events will be celebrated there as well. So where does all this get us back to trying to understand monuments in the past? So I can imagine the groans in the audience at this point. So how am I going to start talking about the moon and and places like Callanish? I'm going to start with the sun and Stonehenge. Oh dear, yawn. Anyway, but I have to do this bit, but this is important, right? Okay, so here's the axis at Stonehenge. Points at midwinter sunset in the one direction, midsummer sunrise, which all the crowds come to see in the other direction. And most of us archaeologists believe that probably the more important direction was actually the midwinter sunset, because the formal approach, which was later memorialized into an avenue, comes from this direction. So you would expect the sacred stuff to be going on in front of you. That's not to say that the midsummer sunrise wasn't important as well. But here's the meat. This is the bit I really wanted to bring home. We have to think about the precision. When we say that something was solstitially lined, how precise was it in their minds? There's a difference between precision and accuracy, and I'll probably get myself caught up in this as well. But if you want to know the difference between precision and accuracy, by the way, there's a beautiful thing on the internet which involves President Obama and his cats. And so if you want to know about this, they're basically just Google precision accuracy Obama cats, and it comes up with this lovely little 3x3 table of high precision, medium, low precision, high accuracy, medium, low accuracy. Gives you an idea. So what I'm talking about is precision. How precise did it have to be for them, as opposed to accurately? How accurately can we measure it, which may have lots to do with how the site's deteriorated or been changed in the past, whatever. I'm talking about what it meant to them here. And the point about Stonehenge is in the middle here. It pinpoints the solstices accurately in space. So the sun's diameter, if any of you like numbers there, it's half a degree. If you don't, that means you can fit 720 suns around the horizon if you wanted to. But basically, Stonehenge pinpoints both the sunrise and the sunset to this sort of accuracy to the sun's disk. What that means is that it doesn't pinpoint, it's not accurate enough to pinpoint the day of the solstice, because around the solstice, the sun rises in pretty much the same direction for several days on end. The difference between where it rises on the solstice and the next day is absolutely tiny, tiny. And that's, of course, how it worked in the past. In my view, Stonehenge wasn't an accurate calendar of any sort like that. And I mean, how could it be? You know what the British weather's like, for goodness sake. It would have been cloudy half the time. But that didn't matter. What mattered to people was at some point around the actual solstice, maybe a week either side, but someday the sun would be seen rising or setting in the right position. And that's when you would hold your ceremonials, do whatever you did on the solstice. And that was enough of a pinpointing. That was enough for turning the seasons. And that is what I would call a precision alignment. Now, going back to Alexander Thom briefly, what he was speculating was going on in Scotland was a much higher precision than that, a precision that would actually be great enough to pinpoint a solstice or a lunar event in time. And to do that, you need a much greater precision, a precision of something like a 50th of the sun or moon's diameter. And it was an idea, it was a clever idea of Tom. So what he said was happening, and here's a standing stone at Kintraw, which was one of his lunar observatories, Callanish was another. And now, in fact, this is a standing stone. It's associated with 3 cairns, as we know. But what he was looking at was the standing stone. What he said was, if you stood at a position where he alleged was a platform, and this was excavated, there was lots of controversy about that. The idea is that there's this natural notch in a mountain on the horizon. And the clever idea of Tom's, it was a clever idea, it was a brilliant idea, was that people in the past were using the horizon as the natural horizon as an observing instrument. And if you position yourself in the right place relative to a nice big notch in a mountain, like that one at Kintraw, then here's the sun coming down on the solstice, the winter solstice. A couple of days before or after, it rises ever so slightly further north. You see that difference? Further up. I'll just show you again. There it is on the solstice. There it is a couple of days before or after. Now, of course, you wouldn't normally notice that difference. But because you're at this site, here's the sun coming down. On that day, sooner or later, you catch the tiny bit at the top of the sun glinting in that notch. And that was his idea. And people were marking the observing places with these standing stones. That was Tom's idea. Lovely idea. It didn't stand up to scrutiny. This was something I was very interested in the 70s and 80s. And basically, it all comes down to how you select notches. Of course, there's a lot of mountains in Scotland, and there's a lot of places with lots of nice notches on the horizon. And what Tom was doing unwittingly was choosing ones that fitted the theory and missing out ones that didn't. So sadly, I don't think there's any evidence that really backs up that theory. It doesn't mean it wasn't happening, but it just isn't carried forward by the evidence. So let's come back to this, if I can. Let's come back to this again. And so let's rule out this one. But let's come back to this one, broadly aligned, the low precision. Because I think there are many things that are broadly aligned on the solstice, and including, for example, cairns on Orkney. Now, people talk about the Maes Howe, particularly. This has an alignment. Oh gosh, its passage is broadly aligned on the solstice. And this is the winter suns, midwinter sunset. It's actually a few days before or after when the light effect is best. But if you look at it as an overall pattern, this was studied by archaeologist David Fraser back in the early 80s, and then Mike Park Pearson, Colin Richards did a whole lot more work in Orkney, and Colin was excavating the villages in the Orkneys back in the day. And you get a pattern of orientation, both of houses and of these passage tombs, houses for the living, houses for the dead, very broadly upon the solstices, broadly around northeast, but avoiding the cardinal directions in between. And what I and others attempted to interpret from this is that it's rather similar to, and here's just the modern example from indigenous North America, from the Navajo. And the Navajo believe that the cosmos is divided into 4 quarters, each which has many properties, and you reflect that in the design of your houses. And to cut a long story short, for that reason, the doors of the houses always face broadly east. Now, and other things face broadly north, west, and south. Are we looking at something like that? If we are here, you could call these, and Maes Howe just happens to fit in that pattern. They're cosmological. It's to do with how people understand everything around them to be organized. And it's important to orient things broadly in certain ways, perhaps around the solstices, but they won't be at all accurate. And it's that difference between cosmological, rather broader orientations, and perhaps accurate enough to spot something and to time a ceremony or something, or not accurately in our terms, that I think is important. Right, here's the techie stuff. You can ignore this if you're not too bothered. This is only a quick techie stuff, but here's the sun. Oh, no, here's the sun. Here's what the sun does. So here's our pizza. I promised I'd mention pizzas again. If you're somewhere in Lincolnshire, probably not anywhere much in Scotland, and you had a clear, it's flat all around you, clear, pretty flat horizon. You're standing on this pizza in the middle. Here's all the directions around you. You see the sun rising in the northeast in summer, pass over, days are long. And as the year goes through, by the time you get to the winter, the days are very short, and in between the sun is rising on an in-between path. If you look down on the pizza, what you see over here, this is a Stonehenge, but it's the same story. The numbers are slightly different if you come up to Scotland or the Hebrides in particular. But basically, the overall, it's the same. The sun rises, and its sun rising position just goes like a pendulum back and forth between these positions over the year, and that's why it stays a while near to each solstice sunrise. Well, the moon, yes, I've got onto the moon. The moon does the same thing, but it does it over a time scale of just 27 days. Not a whole year, but just 27.3 days. So it whizzes up and down the horizon. And so the moon's pendulum is swinging up and down the horizon very fast if you're looking at the moonrise position. And that means that, of course, and you remember the moon's only rising once a day, so it'll go past one of these positions and then it'll rise. But added to that, the limits of this motion to and fro also vary. So here's the limit, here's where it's going in 1 year, and then 9.5 years later, it'll be going much further north and south, much further than the sun. And then 9.5 years later, again, it'll be going between these little limits. So this limit, this northern limit, this is actually the lunar stice, the monthly limit, is itself moving. And it's this that leads to this term standstill. This stands still every 18.5 years. What that means in practice is that around every 18th or 19th year, there's a period of time Nothing actually stands still. It's the most awful term you can imagine. It's really, really misleading. But I mean, the moon never stops whizzing up and down the horizon and rising and setting at different times. But around these times of the major standstills, for about a year or two, either side, you will, from time to time, see the moon rising or setting exceptionally far north or south. Now, those times will be at different times of the day. It's not like the sun, which conveniently, of course, rises at dawn every day, because that's what the sun is. The moon can rise at any time. Half the time it rises in daylight and you can't see it. Its phase changes. It's difficult to see. So, and these major standstills, when it can be seen exceptionally far north, well, as Alison said at the beginning, we're approaching one now. We're in this period when you can see the moon rising and setting exceptionally far north and south. Now, I've been interested in this in relation to some of these the sites in Scotland for many years. But going back, gosh, when I thought about it, it's actually slightly more than 50 years now, which is absolutely frightening. Anyway, and of course, the interest was triggered by Alexander Thom's theories, which I fairly quickly came to think were not going to be borne out by the evidence. But on the other hand, I certainly was not going to throw away the baby with the dishwater, because there were astronomical connections. In North Mull, just as one of the projects I got involved in, because Tom had looked at some of these sites, there are a number of short stone rows, 3, 4, 5 stone rows, 10, 15 of them or so, including this one at Glengorm, which doesn't look like a stone row at all. This is an old photo, sorry about the quality, but it's from, you'll see it's 3 stones in a rather strange formation. But actually, I went back there in '89 and excavated the site with Roger Martlew, and we discovered that this stone has been moved, and the stone hole was here. It actually was another stone row. And what's more, the stone row was aligned upon a prominent mountain on the south of the island. I'm sorry it's so dim in this picture, you probably can't even make it out, but there it is, I'm outlining it. Ben More, which is an isolated high peak. It's a 3,000 foot peak on South Mull. It's isolated, it's very prominent. And these stones are lined up on it, and what's more, it's also aligned upon where the setting point of that most southerly moon, and that really got our interest up. Well, a whole lot of technical stuff followed. I'm not going to go into this. Don't worry. Don't also sign off. But basically, a lot of studies about how this all panned out, looking at different places in the landscape. We discovered a number of things that. And I'm also looking at stone rows more widely in Argyll, again, as part of critiquing Tom, but also seeing what else it told me. Discovering that there's a very strong trend of orientation, sort of northeastish, southwest. I can't say it at all. Southwestish. I'm not sure whether I need a G&T or whether this is water. I'm drinking water anyway. That this seemed to be associated in the south with the moon at its most southerly, and a lot of these sites were oriented on the moon in its most southerly, particularly towards the setting position. There were a few that seemed to be more solstitial, but where we found those, they were right next to another one that was lunar, and that was an interesting trend. We looked at the orientation of visibility, discovered that many of these sites, particularly on Mull, the natural way of the landscape there is northwest to southeast. You can kind of see it. This is a very poor quality picture, which I apologize, but my house is being redone at the moment, and the whole place is in chaos, and so all my files and things, or 3/4 of them, are all locked away, and I can't get at them, which is my excuse. But anyway, and the topography here is naturally northwest southeast, but these sites are being placed in very special positions, so you can actually see to the southwest. And very often they're not on nearby hilltops where you can see all round. They're nestled into places where you can only see in the southwest direction. Very interesting. So that's what this sort of stuff is all sort of quantifying. And the other thing, which comes back, just going back briefly, that picture of Ben More, these 3 stones are kind of right on the edge of where you can see Ben More. Come over this way and it's clear. And the situation is slightly obscured by the trees growing here, but with or without the trees, come 10 meters this way, you can see Ben more clearly. Go 10 meters that way, trees or no trees, it would be hidden. And this was a property, and that's what actually this graph's showing is all about, is that all 5 of these are right on that edge. And maybe that's telling us something as well. So lots of issues to do like that were coming in. And this is words, don't ponder it. All this was, what it's saying basically is that there's this interest in mountains and the moon, it seems to be, amongst these monuments on Mull. And the same seems to apply in other parts of Argyll, but there the topography is not against you. So come down to south of Kilmartin, the flat plain south of Kilmartin. Generally, you've got clear views down in that direction anyway. So all those sites do the same thing, but you're not fighting the topography. I suspect that all of this it's broad. Some of them are a couple of degrees out, 2 or 3 degrees out. I think it's something cosmological. I don't think these are exact observing instruments for the moon, but I do think they have a lunar association, and I still believe that 40 years on. I have to mention recumbent stone circles. Then I will get to Callanish next, but I must, because these have or have been claimed to have quite a strong association with the moon. Now, about 70 of these that are still in reasonable condition around Grampian region. And the thing about them is that they have a distinctive, very large recumbent stone, which gives a sense of direction to these stone circles. Here's a couple of examples. And of course, that introduces an interest in the orientation. And that was something that I was studying back in 1984. And here you see some beautiful graphs produced by Simon Welfare in his couple of books, Great Crowns of Stone, in 2011. Absolutely beautiful books and a wonderful piece of work. But and where he's corrected some of my figures and produced these beautiful graphs, but they show you this broad trend in orientation. And in fact, there's 2 ways you can define it. This was something that I came up with in 84, which actually obscures things, but you have to face up to it. There's 2 ways you can measure the orientation, and whether you measure one or the other or both depends on the state of the site and what's missing now, and you can't help it. Anyway, that's a detail I don't want to go into. The point being that back in 1981, Aubrey Burl, Aubrey Burl produced a paper in Antiquity, the archaeological journal, saying and claiming that these were sites that were related to the southern moon. And his evidence for that was on grounds of the orientations. Here's the path of the moon going over the south direction at its southernmost, so it just skims over the horizon. And virtually all of the orientations, these are Burl's figures, fall within this range. And then there's just an odd few outliers which come right out here, which fall, and that minimum, you remember that graph of the moon? This is the minimum moon. It's called the minor standstill. I don't want to go into that unless anyone wants me to in the afterwards. But this was, and Aubrey argued strongly that these were related to the moon. I was much taken by this argument, particularly, and published a couple of papers with Aubrey trying to take this forward in 85. That was why I was measuring a lot of the orientations, because at that time we were looking for groups of monuments that seemed to have similar trends and similar astronomical trends. And there seemed to be more to it than that, because Aubrey was arguing that there were quartz that were maybe reflecting the moon, and also that some of the cut marks were only on the recumbent stones and the flankers, and one stone either side, always in that direction of the moon as well. And so this seemed really strong evidence for an association with that southernmost moon. People were aware of this 18.6 year cycle and held ceremonies periodically. All that was overturned by Richard Bradley when he started to excavate. And he excavated 3 of the sites. Tom Navery was one, and a couple of other circles. And And that is all described in his book, The Moon and the Bonfire, which I discovered just researching with this afternoon. Is now available online. Thank you, Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. It's become available free online, which is brilliant. But basically what Richard discovered was that sites like Tom Navery had started out as cairns, and that the cairn material was moved. So there's no way you can really argue that these were built to be ceremonial places. And this is, of course, one of the problems with doing all this. You look at what's there on the surface, and what you have to actually look more closely at the archaeology for is to see about development of the sites and whether they've changed. It may be that these sites were, when they were set up, an initial orientation was to do with the moon. I've kind of come back from that. I think, I was enthusiastic about this idea now. What I argued for a long time, and I argued that in my Yale book that Alison was saying, was that if they were not interested in the 18.6-year cycle per se, but they were interested in full moonrise at a solstice, and that they were orienting these sites at a full moon near the solstice, what you would end up is a pattern of orientation that was mostly either at the major standstill end or a minor standstill end, but not very much in between. And if you had all the sites here and here, that would work. But what's the problem is that you've got many of these sites, you've kind of got two different sets of ideas here. I'm more inclined to believe now that, yes, they may have something to do with the moon, but they may well also, and some of them certainly, but others will have more to do with landscape, the sun, and maybe other things. I don't think the moon was an overarching factor. And of course, we're not talking about repeated ceremonials here. We're talking about what was in the minds of the people as they set these sites up. And this is, of course, what we do. We have to develop our ideas as new evidence comes along. The other thing, finally, I just wanted to point out, the moon looks larger when it's near the horizon. Everyone knows this. It isn't larger, of course. It just looks larger because you've got things in the landscape which you can compare it against. And so your mind makes it seem larger. And that's important when we come on to Callanish itself. So here's a couple of beautiful pictures, and this one showing, looking to the south at Callanish itself, with the outcrop Calanais, I hope I can pronounce it correctly, just to the south of the site there. And what we know, I had to throw this in because just a little bit of history of the site. I was actually working on Patrick Ashmore's dig at the site in 1980, and here's just a couple of pictures. And I don't know whether you have anything like these, but I'm happy to add them to your archives if you don't. But 3 or 4 pictures of the stone, which is 33A, the extra stone on the end of the eastern line, being lifted and put into the stone hole. And there's Patrick himself pointing at a bit of it for some reason. I have no idea what. Anyway, just a little bit of history thrown in there. And so we know about how the what the moon would look like. And this was calculated back in the 80s by Margaret Gerald Ponting. Gerald, I understand you're in the audience. Fabulous. I'm really happy to know that. Hello there. So yeah, and this was from a paper they published in a book I edited way back in 1981. And of course, they were there watching it in 88, 2 standstills ago. 2 major standstills ago. But here you see the path of the southernmost moon as viewed from the north in the avenue, and rising over this hill that's got called the Sleeping Beauty. There's no ethnographic evidence for that, but it's sort of adopted that name. And here, and you see, because the moon is so low, it doesn't sort of rise up, it just skims along the horizon. And as seen from north end of the avenue, it starts to skim down behind Callanish, and then just re-gleams behind a few of the stones. I mean, if the stones weren't there, you'd see it just moving to the right down the horizon. But because the stones are there, you see it flashing between the stones as it goes, depending exactly where you're standing. and that's the southernmost possible path of the moon. Of course, you might look, and this will happen sometime over the next year or two, the end of the month. Not every month does the moon get that far down, even near a standstill. It just depends when the moon rises, or the moon rises and sets those 4 hours when it's moving across, how that falls in the 24-hour period and how that relates to the monthly cycle. It might be a bit higher in any given month, but that's the minimum possible. And so, yeah, I'm glad I put that in, Gerald. So here's your own picture of the moon rising. Now that was taken from Cnocan Tursa, as I understand that. So that's actually taken from Cnocan Tursa. And this is the picture that was taken of someone standing on Cnocan Tursa with the moon behind them. Clearly a hugely spectacular event, and I hope some of you get to see something like that Friday night, Saturday morning, and we'll be watching too from afar. Now, how do we put that together with the archaeology? And I just wanted to just bring in just a little bit of the dating, as we now know from the excavations and things. So we know, and I think I'm right in saying this surprised Patrick at the time when all this information came back. But that basically the circles and the tall center stone were built first. Then, something like up to 500 years later, the chamber tomb is built inside the circle on one side. And then what we know from the dating, well, we have a date from, or well, at least a stratigraphy from stone 30 here, which indicates that the rows and presumably the alignment, the avenue, were later, quite plausibly around the same time as the cairn, or possibly a bit later still. So we know basically the circle is there and then the avenue is later, which leads to this idea that you'll see out there on the internet that, that when the avenue was constructed, then possibly that was incorporating this motion of the moon as part of the ceremonial attached to the cairn. And you see the wording there. Again, this is straight off the internet. Not only oriented the monument towards the standstill moon, but directed attention and movement. The moon comes down here towards the chamber tomb and its important occupants. Well, it's speculation, but I think it's a pretty plausible speculation as it goes. That's that association was a real one. It's something I hope you'll all be thinking about and looking into, as because I think something that happens when you're actually there seeing the thing firsthand. It gives you insights that maybe you didn't get when you were just crunching numbers or measuring things with a theodolite or digging holes. I think it's important to see these things if you can. And indeed, that's what we're trying to do back at Stonehenge. And I think, are doing that. So here is me a month ago, 2 o'clock in the morning at Stonehenge, feeling freezing cold. Amanda's there as well, but she's sort of very shadowy in the background. And we've watched the moonrise at Stonehenge as part of, again, trying to get some of those insights for ourselves at Stonehenge. And again, for us, it's a question of, I'll come back, a question of precision, and that also affects how we might interpret the lunar alignments at Stonehenge. So we'll be there Friday night, as Amanda's mentioned, doing our own live stream as well as trying to do our measurements and things, except it won't be at 2 o'clock in the morning for us. It will be 10 o'clock in the evening at dusk, which is nice. And of course, then followed by the moon rising a little bit later and doing its thing at Callanish. Now, think about Stonehenge then briefly. Am I right? Oh, I am running a little over, but that's fine. I hope that's fine anyway. At Stonehenge, you have around the big Sarsen circle, you have 4 station stones. Now, of course, Stonehenge has its chronology as well. The ditch and background, the edge is something like 500 years earlier than the Sarsen stones, exactly when the smaller The smaller bluestones were brought from Wales is a matter of some debate, but it probably was not long before the Saracens, maybe at the same time, possibly a few centuries earlier. But the point being that the four station stones, although they're unworked stone, come from exactly the same place 30 kilometers to the north as the big Saracens. We now know that from the geology, which tends to make us think that these, and this wasn't known back in the days when people like Richard Atkinson were excavating Stonehenge 50 years ago, more than that. We now believe that probably these station stones are broadly contemporary with the Saracens. Another reason for thinking that is that these they basically just enclose the Saracen circle. So these lines, the longer lines along the rectangle, just miss the Saracen circles. So basically, I mean, two of them are now missing, but here's, you can see along here the view lines along these, and you're always looking, of course, some of the Saracen stones are missing too, but you're always looking just outside the Saracen stone. It's as if those long viewing lines were deliberate, but they're across the main axis, the main solstitial axis of the site. And as it happens, I mean, one of those directions, here's the four station stones, is towards the northernmost moon set. The other is less precisely towards the southernmost moonrise. And our question is, well, was that even deliberate? Because it is roughly at right angles to the main axis. Was it something that was discovered afterwards? Or was it indeed deliberate? We're now looking into the possibility the station stone rectangle wasn't actually precisely rectangle. Was it a bad attempt at a rectangle, or was it coding in something more precise to do with the moon? There are other reasons for believing the moon was actually important in the early phase of the monument, before even the stones arrived. It was a burial monument, and that's some work I did with Josh Pollard a few years ago, looking at where burials were placed, because this was a site of the dead for centuries before the stones were brought here. People were burying things in the ditch, things were burying things in a ring of post holes, or maybe just a ring of holes that was built around the Aubrey holes around that time. People were cremating people, putting cremation remains and also bones of animals, other offerings, but they were concentrating them in various places near the entrances, and also enigmatically in this direction down here, where there was no entrance. Why were they interested in that direction? We think that might have been because they were broadly interested in the moon. So all of that going on. I was going to plug my book here, but thank you, Alison, you've done it for me. So all of this is in the book. We're still finding out more at Stonehenge, and I believe there's a lot more to be found out at Callanish. I'm certainly not giving you thoughts about that, giving you more input to that. But my own final thoughts. Now, I haven't been actively working on Scottish megaliths for 30 years and more. You know, and coming back to it, and of course I've done a lot of places, work in a lot of places like Peru and in Polynesia, where there is ethnohistory to inform. What does that leave me thinking about, particularly some of these lunar alignments back in Scotland? And just very broadly, I do believe that these lunar alignments at places like Stonehenge, places like Callanish, were noticed, were deliberate, were important. But I don't myself believe that there is any evidence, strong evidence, that people were aware of the 18.6-year cycle as such. What my own feeling is at Stonehenge, and I would apply the same to Callanish, is that every now and again, people would discover that the moon was, or see the moon rising or setting somewhere exceptional. And that would become important, and that would be remembered. And it might happen a few times, and people might then revere those directions. And then, of course, it wouldn't happen again. And that would be something, then suddenly, you know, a generation later, it would happen, and the elders would say, "Oh, we remember that," and it would, and gradually, where the moon would be seen would be venerated, and I think perhaps eventually memorialized at places like Stonehenge and also Callanish. but that doesn't mean that people were aware that this was going to happen every 18.6 years. My own feeling would be that these directions become venerated because the moon is sometimes seen there, and when it happens again, of course, a generation might skip because the weather might be cloudy on those occasions. But people were then venerated again when it happened again. And that's where I think the middle ground is, in my mind anyway, between believing on the one hand they were astronomical instruments, which I don't with great precision, and believing they had nothing to do with astronomy at all, which I absolutely don't. I'm sure they had a lot to do with astronomy, and I think they had probably a lot more to do with astronomy than we can ever find out. But I am not someone who likes to speculate greatly beyond the evidence. I'd rather have solid archaeology and solid archaeoastronomy behind my ideas. Thank you for listening, and happy to attempt to answer questions anyway.
That was absolutely wonderful, Clive. Thank you. Thank you. We could sit and listen to you all evening. So folks, if you want to put your questions in the chat box, we already have a few. So Hayley Winslade says, what does Clive think of Michael Dames's book, The Avebury Cycle, and the diagram of quarters, brackets, quarter days, which Dames had tied into the agricultural cycle?
This relates back to, in some ways, to Tom's calendrical idea that people were able to divide the year into exact quarters, or maybe even to eighths or even sixteenths, as Tom would speculate, by the solstices, and then the equinoxes, by which I mean the quarter days, the halfway in time between the solstices. And hence you would have quarter day alignments, and some of his sites were. Now, the problem with that, well, I have a number of problems with that. One of them, there is a tendency, first of all, to think that equinoxes are clearly as important as the solstices. They are in our minds, maybe, and so we look for alignments on equinoxes. Now, you can mean different things by the equinoxes anyway. You can mean a halfway point in space, halfway point in time, when the day is equal to the night. There are various different things. They're all different. The halfway point in time makes sense if people were counting off the days. But I just don't see the strong evidence for that. So my feeling is that quarter day alignments are unlikely in themselves to if you're picking those and not picking other alignments, I'm not convinced by them. I mean, this was always the problem with Tom's calendar, was that you would have a sort of solstice alignment here and a quarter day alignment somewhere else and a mid-quarter day alignment somewhere else again. But that said, just to show you that I keep an open mind on these matters, there is a very interesting site called Godmanchester, which I do mention right at the end of the book, where we do seem to have a quarter day and solstice alignments built into the site. And this was a wooden timber site that was built almost 1,000 years before Stonehenge. Now, I find that doesn't fit my mindset at all, and I want to know more about other monuments like that, if we can find out, to see if that is repeated. So absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but I'm not convinced.
Thank you very much. That's great. Our next one comes from Graham Allen. Could people have chosen which of the celestial calendars to follow as they aligned with the other indicators for the passage of time in a particular place?
Yeah, I think absolutely so. I think all calendars, I mean, like the Morsi calendar I mentioned, are likely to have mixed different calendrical indicators, some of them astronomical, some of them not astronomical. The moon is very often a very common factor in that, but people like the Morsi themselves would use plants and other seasonal indicators, weather and other things, to also indicate different times in the year. A lot of people have solar horizon calendars, and again, now very often they can mark the solstices because those can have cosmological significance, quartering the landscape as well as any sort of calendrical significance. But also where people tend to mark off dates in the calendar like that, if they're looking at sunrise, will be specific to their culture. So there may be dates when they, the sun is rising and some discernible landmark, and that's the time to plant something or or so on. It's telling you to do something in the agricultural calendar, and those sort of calendrical markers are very common. But there can also be ceremonial markers. So, when the sun rises over a sacred mountain, that's the time to hold a particular ceremony. So you can have a mixture of all those different things. And I think, again, astronomy is just part of this general social mix, and that'll vary from one culture to another.
Lovely, thank you. Louise Barnes says, do you find Professor Terence Meaden's ancient Celtic eightfold calendar is present at Callanish or any other site? So this, in a sense, goes back to what you were saying, but also goes to the question about what the significance is of the rows, the east row, the west row, and the north.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean they're slightly off the equinoxes. That was something I measured up in 1981. It's deep in my 1984 book somewhere. So they don't seem to quite go with the equinoxes, if I remember rightly. So I don't see that evidence all coming together at Callanish. That was something that I was interested in trying out back in the 80s.
Good. Right, next one. We got lots of questions. Kelly Beatty,
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that the station stones are now thought to be contemporary with the Sarsen Circle because their long sight lines just enclose it. But why couldn't the Sarsens have been built much later with a diameter to match the sight lines?
Well, they could have been built at the same time as the station stones in order to help lay it out. That has been suggested. So I think it's valid to suggest that they may have no astronomical purpose. They may have a geometrical purpose. And that maybe they were put there and the Sarsen stone was laid out in the middle of the Sarsen circle was laid in the middle. I do find that a little unconvincing per se, because well, yes, you've got the long sight lines which confine the edge of the Sarsen circle, but why not put them along the axis? Why put them perpendicular to the axis? I think that raises a few questions. It seems strange. But yeah, I think I don't know that the astronomical purpose is like to be the be all and the end all of the station stones at all. And of course, the short sides of the rectangle are pointing along the axis. They're solstitial. So I think that's still, for me, quite an open question as to whether those lunar alignments are precise or were deliberate from the start, or whether it was discovered that the moon was aligning with them. But because of those earlier burials, I'm inclined to think that there was knowledge of the moon to begin with. The odd thing is that the alignment is much more precise to the northwest, the northernmost setting, than it is to the southeast. The thing about the moon is that with the solstitial sun, the two directions are opposite at Stonehenge. The moon, the directions aren't opposite. And the reason for that is a thing called lunar parallax. It's all technical, but it's to do with the fact that we're not at the center of the Earth and the moon's quite close to us. And if anyone in the audience, well, I suddenly saw a Simon Banton come in, so I know there are at least one person in the audience who's with what I'm saying about that. But yeah, so it's odd that the more precise one is to the northwest, not to the southeast.
Okay, thank you. A. Oswald, could that be Al Oswald? As far as we know, most of the British Isle, Britain and Ireland, was covered in forest up to 35 metres high until the middle of the Bronze Age. Given the low angle of declination at the solar winter solstice and its lunar equivalents, how much does tree cover affect the alignments?
Depends on the place, but it can do. We see that at Stonehenge now. In fact, if you're watching the live stream, you'll see this happening as the moon comes up. It comes up quite a bit to the right, and that is well, it's partly to do with the fact that the moon position has shifted by a moon diameter in the last 5,000 years, but it's also to do with the fact there's tree cover there now. So you then say, well, was there tree cover there in the past? Well, at Stonehenge, we have some evidence now. People like Mike Allen have looked at this, and there's now a school of thought, archaeological thought, that the whole Stonehenge plain may never have been tree covered since the Mesolithic. And that wasn't thought like that until recently, but that is now looking as if it was the case. Others here probably can answer the question as regards Callanish better than I can, but I think there's no strong evidence for any tall tree cover at Callanish around, is there? I don't know if anyone can answer that. No.
Good question. But Mike Allen's paper is it's online. It's in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society.
Correct.
Okay, another one for you from Rod Thorne. It seems significant to me that the same effect can be seen every month during a season. Do you agree?
Well, the same effect can be seen every month. Well, in theory, it can be seen every month, but in practice, it's very, very difficult. I mean, one thing is, so the moon is rising an hour or so later and setting an hour or so later every night. And so this means that when it reaches the southernmost or the northernmost its monthly swing, that can happen at all different times of the day and night. And also it can happen at different phases of the moon. So sometimes it's going to happen when the moon is a very thin sliver. When it happens in the day or night, you're not going to see it. When it happens during the day, you're not going to see it. So actually, and we can see this when we were gauging the times we had to try to be at Stonehenge to catch one of these events. They seem very random when you look at it. I mean, they are occurring at 27.3 day intervals, give or take. But it's actually quite difficult you have to know what you're doing to catch one. So people in the past would only have caught one if they'd been up at different times and looking at the moon quite a lot. I can't imagine that people were systematically anticipating the moonrise that had that sort of level of knowledge at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
So Ian McHardy, hi Ian, who's just also recently published a book about Callanish. If they
Hey.
were aware of the locations of the extremes of the moon, surely it's not too much to imagine they would count the period in between it happening. In this context, do you think that the fact that there are 19 stones in the avenue could be significant?
I think it's very dangerous to make that sort of argument. I mean, why? And yes, I know there are certain places around the world, Indian temples or whatever, Buddhist temples and so on, where numbers are encoded into things. People have speculated that certain of there's one Mayan pyramid that has 365 steps, maybe that's significant. This sort of is sort of numerological game in a way. Yes, it may be the case, but it's very, very it's very, very easy to see numbers that seem to be significant. I mean, we've had archaeologists doing this. I mean, one of our prominent archaeologists was claiming at Stonehenge recently that the fact that there are 18 that there are what were the numbers? I can't remember how numbered. He got the calendrical numbers out of it somehow, and it's difficult. You can't gainsay it, but it's too easy to fit what seem to be astronomical numbers. I think every time you see a 19 or every time you see a 30, could that be lunar significant? And even at a place like Callanish, I find that a dangerous argument myself.
Okay, thank you.
I'm being so negative here, aren't I?
Don't worry.
It's with me. I am a hyper cautious sort of person. It's how I am with evidence, really. Yeah. Anyway.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Al Oswald again. What do you think of the proposed link with Orion's belt at Thornborough Henges?
Right. I think the proposed link with Orion at Thornsborough Henges, and this was some stuff that was done a few years ago. And I think that is really intriguing because the archaeological evidence there shows that there seem to have been huge pilgrimages to this place, and that there were a whole lot of quite important artifacts and valuable artifacts that were deposited and left around the henges, not within them, but around them, as if people were coming and going. And the evidence points to the fact that, and well, first of all, you have to ask, how did all these people manage to get there all at the same time? And one way that could have happened is by looking at the behavior of stars. And it just happens that Orion or maybe Sirius would, the thing about any star, apart from ones that are near the north or south, is that they rise 4 minutes earlier every day throughout the year. And so there comes a time when you can't see them because they're only up in the day, and then you start to see them just before dawn. That's called the heliacal rise, and that marks a particular time in the seasonal year. And so people may have been looking for Orion to appear before dawn and then set out on the pilgrimage, and then they would have come to the site at the same time. And there are alignments on some of the henges. So archaeologist Jan Harding studied all this about 15 years ago now, and had some plausible arguments that people really were observing these things. And what's more, the site and the different structures there, cursuses and then the henges, span like a millennium and a half, and the alignments seem to shift a bit with precession, which is the star risings change in that time. All that's interesting, and I think that's one of the most plausible connections between a prehistoric monument and stars. Stars are difficult generally because there's so many of them, they shift about a lot. But as to your original question, which I haven't actually forgotten, the idea that the three monuments mimic Orion's belt, I find a bit more problematic. Yes, I know the middle one's slightly out of the align. And it kind of, maybe I'm being overcautious, and maybe the reason for that is the Orion mystery and the idea that Egyptian pyramids and things can be laid out in the shape of constellations. And I have issues with that on so many different levels. I mean, the main thing is that you can basically, if you have a collection of things, be they monuments or be they buildings or whatever the heck you like, and dots on a map, and you have some constellations or you look stars in the sky, and it's surprisingly easy to fit one to the other. And I remember there was a documentary a decade or two ago, which showed that the tallest buildings in New York City, I think the 7 or 8 of them, fitted brilliantly to one of the constellations, Leo, I think it is. And if you're prepared to just miss out the odd monument or the odd star that doesn't fit and bend the other, you can fit almost anything to anything. So that makes me highly suspicious. And anyway, why would people want to do it? Where people do want to make star maps, and where we know of indigenous star maps, very often they don't look like, that people aren't representing things accurately in space. They're representing them in the way that is right for them. And so why would you even lay out things with any sort of accuracy, let alone placing things on the ground? So there's lots of problems with that. I'm still being negative, but I think other aspects of the Orion connection at Thornborough are really plausible and interesting.
Interesting. Mike Evstathiou. Hi, Mike. If there was no awareness of an 18.6-year cycle of the major lunar standstill, for example, why would you go to any effort to monumentalize the alignment? That's a lot of effort for the occasional view of a lunar event every other generation.
I think at Stonehenge, the feeling would be that, I mean, we have this concentration of burials and offerings in the southeasterly direction, which, it's a concentration perhaps within a degree or so of the most southerly moonrise and a little bit inside that, which I think could be explained if people are occasionally seeing something in that direction and are awed by it and remember it and mark it in a temporary way, and that gets remembered down the generations, then something like that could then get memorialized and monumentalized, if you like, in a more permanent way later. And I think, in a sense, the whole of it may be that's the story as a whole at Stonehenge, and the idea that Stonehenge and a couple of the contemporary monuments were placed where they were because of what seemed to us natural coincidences in the landscape. So, but Stonehenge itself, Durrington nearby, this also applies to another site nearby, which seemed to be placed at the heads of valleys which lead off down to the river in a solstitial direction, just a coincidence of nature. But in that mindset and another mindset could make those places special. And we see those places special, like at Stonehenge, gradually developing into a burial place and then developing into this huge monument. So I think it may be a gradual process that is added to over time. Now, how that would play out at Callanish, I think that would have to be thought about. I'm only talking about Stonehenge here, but I think that's a possible idea for Stonehenge.
Lovely. Simon Banton, will you be at the Stonehenge Open Access event Thursday, Friday this week, or just on the evening of the 21st? If you are, then I have something I'd like to show you, Ray Equinox Directions.
Hey, Simon. Hi. No, because I'm doing a thing at Jodrell Bank on the morning of the 21st. So I'm actually not going to be there overnight. Amanda will, and so will Fabio Silva. But I'm going to be up north on the night, and I'm actually going to be driving down in the afternoon of the 21st. So so sadly, no is the answer to your question. I will be there for a couple of days after. And by the way, I eventually answered your question about the Saros cycles and things, which it isn't. Have a look at the supplementary materials.
Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
We've got loads, but we're kind of running out of time now, so we're going to have to be picky. MJ Sharp, not sure if that's Mick Sharp, another 18.6 year cycle question. Curious your thoughts, what might be the significance of the 19 stones at a few stone circles? I'm thinking of the Merry Maidens and the Boscawen and stone circles in Cornwall. Wonderful presentation, thank you.
Yeah, well, so it's really the same thing as I was saying before, although it is interesting, you get odd numbers of stones quite often. In some of these stone circles, but yeah, I mean, I'm cautious about the 19. It goes that there was an American. I don't think you'd call him an archaeoastronomer. He's really an astronomer, a guy called Brad Schaefer, who years ago who was very involved in archaeoastronomy in the early days, who came up with a table, and I think he came up with an astronomical explanation for every number from 1 to I think it was 119. And so I think you do have to be a bit cautious about this. I mean, I was trying this the other day as a sort of counter to this idea that Stonehenge was some sort of calendar based on the numbers of different types of stones and things. I think I could fit it to a Mayan calendar just as easily when I tried. So yeah, caution.
Yes. Thank you. Graham Allen, I've always thought that the accuracy of Tom's observations were excellent, but it was the theory, this cherry picking, that was a bit off. Do you think we can rely on Tom's surveying skills and therefore the data he left us with?
Absolutely agree, and yes. I mean, yes, I mean, there's the odd mistake, but for goodness sake, we all make those. In fact, have you spotted the one or two little mistakes in the book? If not, look at the errata. Simon, you got them within about 3 hours, as I recall. But yeah, and I mean, there's one, like I remember one mistake I noticed, he got the north point at the east point. But basically, yes, he was a good surveyor, and I think you can. But I mean, what you have to be cautious of course, is what he was surveying, and like an example being Woodhenge near Stonehenge, where he was surveying and he did a fantastically accurate survey of the concrete posts that have been laid there following Maud Cunnington's excavations. But as we know, and you can see this fitting in, there's a picture in the book and the supplementary materials on this, that not all of them were accurately on the stone holes. A few of them were off. So I mean, yes, absolutely yes to Tom's skills, but we still got to be a bit cautious on the archaeological side, I think.
Great. The wonderful Claire Tuffy and Andrew Downey. What do you think about Curbstone 52 at Knowth, the lunar calendar stone?
Jury's out, and my own personal jury is still out on that one, Claire. It's an intriguing possibility, I think, is what I would say. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And the very last one from Anna Esteroff. Do you think that the moonrise gradually getting lower in the sky in a major limit year is a helpful way of indicating an approximate time for pilgrims to set off towards their favoured monuments?
I think one of the problems with it is that it doesn't gradually go towards one of these limits. I mean, unlike the sun, I mean, it's galloping up, if I can say it, galloping up and down the horizon every 27.3 days. So, I mean, a couple of days after or before one of these limits, it's going to be way off. So, in a sense, I don't know that you'd get the gradual effect. And bear in mind also the rising or setting time is changing night by night, and weather and so on. So you don't get the sort of like, 2 or 3 weeks as you get with the sun. With a few cloudy nights, you'll still see the gradual limit. So I think it's much more difficult with the moon.
Thank you so, so much. I think you can see from the enthusiasm and the number of questions that we could go on all night, but you've given us the most amazing evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Everybody is very grateful to you. And I just want to say too, thank you to our friends in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, for hosting and for doing the technical wizardry in the background. So Simon, Helen, and Jade Dent, thank you very much. And as we say, don't forget, you can become a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland.